The sun came up slow over Cloverfield, Tennessee, the way it always did in late August, not with any particular mercy, just a flat, copper-colored light that spread across the fields like a warning. Dale Merritt was already awake. He had been awake since 4, sitting on the porch steps with a mug of black coffee going cold in his hand, watching the sky turn from purple to orange while the cicadas finished their night shift and handed the air off to silence. He was 54 years old. His hands looked older. The knuckles were thick and scarred, the palms ridged with calluses built over decades of work, fence posts, and hay bales. Engine blocks and irrigation pipes, the kind of labor that doesn't ask permission and doesn't offer explanations. His face was the same way, weathered, deep, jaw set forward, eyes the color of creek water in winter. People in town said Dale Merritt looked like the land itself had grown him up out of the soil, and they didn't mean it as a compliment exactly. But they didn't mean it as an insult either. It was just what he was. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather, Roy Merritt, had cleared the original 12 acres back in 1951, breaking ground with a borrowed tractor and a stubbornness that people in Cloverfield still talked about. His father, Gene Merritt, had expanded it to 60 acres through the 60s and 70s, adding the cattle pen, the secondary barn, the deep well on the eastern edge. Dale had inherited all of it when Gene died of a heart attack in 1998. The land, the equipment, the reputation, and the debt. There was always debt on a farm like this. That was just the nature of the thing. You borrowed against next year's crop to pay for this year's seed. You borrowed against the equipment to fix the equipment. You borrowed against the land because the land was the only thing the bank believed in, and even then they only believed in it up to a point. Dale had managed it for 26 years the way his father had taught him, carefully, stubbornly, and without asking anyone for help unless there was absolutely no other option. This summer had pushed him past that point. The drought had started in May. Not unusual for Tennessee, droughts came and went, but this one had a particular cruelty to it. It arrived early, settled in hard, and showed no intention of leaving. By July, the creek that ran along the southern edge of the property had dropped to a trickle. By early August, it had stopped altogether. The soybean crop in the eastern field, which Dale had planted with borrowed money and genuine hope, had come up thin and yellow and then simply given up. The corn in the northern section did a little better, but not enough, not nearly enough. He had run the numbers 3 times because the first 2 times he hadn't believed them. After expenses, after the bank payment, after fuel and seed, and the repair on the combine that had broken down in June, he was going to come up short by just over $40,000. In a normal year, that would have been manageable. There were lines of credit, there were extensions. There were conversations with loan officers he'd known for 20 years. But this was not a normal year, and the loan officer he'd known for 20 years, a patient, reasonable man named Phil Grover, had retired in the spring. The man who replaced him was named Arthur Finch, and Arthur Finch was 31 years old and had grown up in Memphis and had never set foot on a working farm in his life. Dale had met with Arthur Finch twice. Both times, Finch had looked at the numbers on his screen with the careful, neutral expression of someone who has already made a decision and is simply performing the courtesy of pretending to consider alternatives. The second meeting had ended with Finch sliding a letter across the desk. Formal language, bank letterhead, the kind of sentences that had been written by lawyers to mean exactly one thing while appearing to mean something slightly softer. The farm had 90 days to resolve the outstanding balance, or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. Dale had driven home without speaking. He'd sat on these porch steps with this same mug of coffee and looked at his fields for a long time. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now, in the copper-colored silence of early morning, he set the mug down on the step beside him and stood up slowly, his knees complaining the way they always did first thing. And he walked out into the yard and kept walking until he reached the fence line at the western edge of the property. This was the field that had beaten him. It was 12 acres of what should have been his best land. Deep soil, good drainage, protected from the worst of the wind by a natural ridge to the northwest. His father had always called it the pocket because it sat slightly lower than the surrounding terrain, cupped like a hand, holding moisture even in dry summers. For 30 years, the pocket had been the most reliable piece of ground on the Merritt farm. Soybeans, tobacco in the early years, winter wheat, corn, whatever Gene or Dale planted there had always come up strong, until the roots. Nobody knew exactly when the old oak had died. It had been standing on the northwestern edge of the pocket since before the Merritt family owned the land, a massive white oak, probably 200 years old, with a trunk nearly 6 feet across and a canopy that had shaded half an acre on its own. Dale's grandfather had planted around it, and his father had planted around it. And Dale had planted around it too, because it was the kind of tree that simply existed beyond argument. It had died 3 years ago. A combination of the changing water table and a fungal infection that had come up through the soil. Dale had watched it happen slowly, the leaves thinning out in the spring of the first year, the bark going gray and soft in patches, and then the second year it hadn't leafed out at all, just stood there dead and enormous against the sky. He'd had it taken down the following spring, paid a timber crew good money to cut it up and haul it away. They'd ground the stump down to below grade level. He'd thought that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. What nobody had told him, what he hadn't known to ask, was that a white oak of that size doesn't just have roots, it has a subterranean architecture. The main root system of a 200-year-old white oak can spread 60, 70, 80 feet from the base of the trunk, and the primary lateral roots can go down 12 feet or more, twisting and branching and interlocking until the soil beneath them is not really soil all but something more like a wooden matrix, roots the thickness of a man's thigh running in every direction. Some of them so old and dense they had hardened to something approaching petrified wood. Dale had discovered this the first time he tried to run his subsoiler through the pocket after the tree came down. The machine had hit something solid 12 inches below the surface and stopped dead, shearing a bolt. He'd backed up, moved 6 feet to the left, tried again. Same result. He'd spent an afternoon digging by hand in 3 different spots and found the same thing each time. Roots. Massive, iron-hard, immovable roots running in every direction just below the tillable surface. The pocket had been useless for 3 years. He'd managed without it mostly. The other fields had covered the gap in most years. But this year, with the drought taking out the eastern field entirely, those 12 acres would have made the difference between breaking even and drowning. If he'd been able to plant the pocket and soybeans this spring, even with reduced yields from the dry summer, he'd have had enough to cover the bank payment with room to breathe. Instead, he was standing at the fence looking at 12 acres of dry grass and dead promise. He heard the truck before he saw it, the particular rattle of Bobby Pruitt's old F250, which had a loose heat shield on the exhaust that Bobby had been meaning to fix for approximately 4 years. The truck came down the county road and turned into Dales's driveway without signaling, because Bobby Pruitt had been turning into Dales's driveway for 30 years and had never once felt the need to signal for it. Bobby was 61, shorter than Dale by 4 inches, wider by about the same margin, with a white beard he kept trimmed, and bright blue eyes that missed very little. He farmed the 200 acres directly north of Dale's property and had been Dale's closest neighbor and closest friend since they were both young men learning the land from their fathers. He climbed out of the truck with a thermos and a paper bag from the diner in town and walked over to the fence without being invited, because he was Bobby Pruitt and that was how he operated. "Brought you a biscuit," he said, holding out the bag. Dale took it. "Appreciate it." They stood at the fence together looking at the pocket. Bobby poured coffee from his thermos into the cap and handed it to Dale, who accepted it without comment, handing his own cold mug to Bobby. County sent a letter, Dale said after a while. I heard. What did you hear? That they're sending an assessment team. Agricultural engineers, somebody from the extension office, a contractor. Bobby paused. Heard Ronald Stass had something to do with it. Dale's jaw tightened slightly. Stass doesn't have anything to do with my land. Not yet, Bobby said without particular inflection. Ronald Stass was 58 years old and had grown up in Cloverfield, the same as Dale and Bobby. But he'd left at 22 for Nashville and come back 15 years later as a different kind of person entirely. He ran a land development company, now Stass Property Group, and in the past decade he had bought up 11 farms in the county, most of them from families who'd run out of road financially. He was not a dishonest man, exactly. He paid fair market value, sometimes better. He just had a particular talent for appearing at the moment when fair market value was the only option left. He had approached Dale twice in the past 2 years. Both times Dale had declined, the first time politely and the second time less so. Engineers can't do anything with those roots, Dale said. I already know that. Maybe not, Bobby said. But let them come. Let them put it in writing that it can't be done their way. Dale looked at him. Why? Bobby was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle over the eastern field. Because sometimes a man needs everyone else to run out of ideas before they'll get out of his way and let him use his own. Dale didn't answer that. He ate his biscuit. The sun kept climbing, and the pocket sat there in the morning light, dry and patient and waiting for something. The assessment team arrived on a Tuesday. There were 4 of them, 2 agricultural engineers from the University of Tennessee Extension program named Marcus Webb and Sandra Cho, a county contractor named Phil Durst, who operated a mid-sized excavation company out of Knoxville, and a soil scientist named Dr. Raymond Okafor, who had driven down from Nashville and seemed mildly surprised by everything he encountered, including the heat. Dale met them at the gate at 8 in the morning and walked them out to the pocket without much conversation. He answered their questions directly and without elaboration. How deep did the roots go? As far as he could tell, 12 feet in some places, maybe more. How far did they spread from the original stump location? He'd found them out to about 70 feet. How long had the tree been dead? 3 years. How long since the stump was ground down? 2 years, spring. Marcus Webb was in his early 40s, lean and professional, with the kind of systematic calm that came from spending a career solving problems with instruments. He walked the field with a ground-penetrating radar unit for 2 hours while Sandra Cho took soil samples and Dr. Okafor crouched in various spots, pressing his fingers into the earth and frowning thoughtfully. Phil Durst walked the perimeter twice, looked at the access points, measured clearances, and made notes on a tablet. Dale stood at the fence and watched them work. At noon, they gathered under the shade of the secondary barn and spread their findings across a folding table. The ground-penetrating radar had mapped the root system more precisely than Dale had expected. Primary lateral roots extending 63 feet from the stump center in 4 main directions. Secondary roots branching off those at irregular intervals. Tertiary roots filling in the gaps. Total coverage of major root material, approximately 9 of the 12 acres. In the remaining 3 acres, the roots were thinner and shallower and could likely be broken up with a heavy ripper. 9 acres locked under iron-hard root structure. Phil Durst had numbers. To excavate the root system mechanically, bringing in hydraulic excavators, root rakes, and stump grinders powerful enough for root material of this density and depth would require equipment his company could provide. But the cost would run between $60,000 and $80,000, depending on what they found when they got below the surface. Timeline: 6 to 8 weeks minimum. Dale listened to this without expression. Dr. Okafor suggested a chemical approach, a specific combination of root kill compounds, injected into the remaining stump and along the primary root lines, which would accelerate decomposition. Less expensive, but the timeline was 2 to 3 years before the soil would be tillable. The compounds themselves weren't cheap, and there was a county permitting process. 2 to 3 years. Marcus Webb was the one who finally said it plainly, in the careful, respectful tone of someone delivering news they know will land hard. The root system of a white oak this age and size in soil with this clay content hardened over this period of time. The conventional approaches were either too expensive to be practical given the farm's financial situation, or too slow to address the immediate problem. There was no affordable, fast solution. He said it twice in different ways to make sure it was understood, and then he looked at Dale with genuine sympathy in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Merritt. Given your timeline and budget constraints, this field is not going to be cleared in time to help your current situation." Dale nodded slowly. "Thank you for coming out." He shook each of their hands. He watched them load their equipment into their vehicles and drive away down the county road. He stood in the driveway for a long time after the last truck disappeared around the bend. Then he went into the house and called his daughter. Caroline Merritt was 31 years old and lived in Nashville, where she worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm. She was her father's daughter in most of the ways that mattered: stubborn, direct, not inclined to waste words, but she had also spent 9 years building a life in the city that was deliberately, carefully different from the one she'd grown up in. She loved her father and the farm in the complicated way of someone who had needed to leave a place in order to understand what it meant to them. She answered on the second ring. Dale told her what the engineers had said. He told her about the bank letter. He told her the numbers, all of them, without softening any of it. He had raised her to handle the truth, and he wasn't going to stop now. There was a pause on her end. "Dad, come on. There has to be something." "There isn't. Not in the time we have." "What about Stas?" "I know you hate the idea, but if—" "No, Dad, Carolyn." His voice was quiet and final. "I'm not selling this land." Another pause. He could hear her breathing, could picture her standing in whatever office she worked in, pressing her free hand flat against the surface of her desk the way she did when she was working through something she didn't like. "Then what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'll figure it out." He hung up before she could ask anything else. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the framed photograph on the wall near the window. His father and his grandfather together in this same yard, sometime in the late 1950s. Both of them squinting into the sun with their arms at their sides, and that particular look on their faces that Dale had spent his whole life trying to understand and had eventually come to recognize as simply this: they were men who did not intend to be defeated. He went out to the barn. The barn was the oldest structure on the Merritt property. Jean had talked about tearing it down a dozen times and never done it, and Dale had done the same, and now it stood with the particular permanence of things that survive not through strength, but through being. Consistently more trouble to remove than to keep. The roof had been patched in 7 places. The walls leaned slightly to the east. But the floor was solid oak planking and the interior was enormous, 40 feet by 60 feet of cluttered, organized chaos that made complete sense to Dale and to no one else. He had not gone into the back section of the barn in almost 2 years. The back section was where the old things lived. His grandfather's equipment, his father's equipment, the accumulation of 3 generations of mechanical problem solving. There were parts of machines that no longer existed as whole machines. There were tools for tasks that no longer needed doing. There were chains and cables and hydraulic components and gearboxes and axles and all the physical grammar of a working farm written in metal and grease and time. And in the far corner, under a canvas tarp that had once been green and was now the color of old leaves, there was the transmission. Dale stood in front of it for a long time. His father had pulled it out of a 1967 International Harvester Farmall. Sometime in the late 1980s, Dale couldn't remember exactly when, only that it had appeared in the barn one day and Jean had said, "Keep that, we'll find a use for it," in the tone of voice he used when he meant something. It was a massive piece of equipment, a direct drive transmission designed for sustained high torque applications. The kind of thing that transferred power without slipping without compromising, without apologizing for the forces it was asked to move. Dale pulled the tarp back. The transmission was exactly where he remembered it. Heavier than memory, the way old things usually were. He crouched down next to it and put his hand on the housing, feeling the cold metal, and he stayed there for a while thinking about a problem that the engineers had declared impossible. The engineers had been thinking about extraction. They had been thinking about excavating, removing, pulling the roots out of the ground as discrete physical objects. That was the conventional approach. Bring enough force to bear in a specific direction and remove the obstacle. Dale had been thinking about something different. He wasn't thinking about removal, he was thinking about rupture. A root that has been in the ground for 150 years, that is hardened to the density of iron, that is locked in place by 60 feet of lateral spread and 12 feet of depth. You cannot pull that root out. The engineers were right about that. No hydraulic puller manufactured in the current century had the geometry to apply force at the right angles to break the bond between that root structure and the earth around it simultaneously. You'd need the pulling point too close to the surface, and the leverage would be wrong, and the root would flex before it broke, and the machine would fail. But if you didn't try to pull it out, if instead you anchored directly to the primary root at depth, using a near vertical pull angle, with enough mechanical advantage through gear reduction to turn raw engine torque into something approaching an irresistible force. Dale walked to the other side of the barn and looked at the chassis of his old primary tractor, a 1988 John Deere 4455 that he'd pulled out of service 2 years ago when the engine seized. The chassis was sound. The rear axle was intact. The hydraulic systems were functional. He walked back to the transmission. He walked back to the tractor. He stood in the middle of the barn doing math in his head, gear ratios, torque multiplication, the mechanical advantage achievable through a series of reductions, and the number he arrived at was not a number any engineer would have written in a report, because it wasn't a number you could source from a catalog or validate with a formula that accounted for all the conventional variables. It was a number that assumed everything would hold: the frame, the anchors, the fabricated pulling arm he would need to build, the modified drive shaft, every weld, every bolt, every point of connection in a system that would be asked to transmit forces it had never been designed to transmit. If anything failed, it wouldn't just fail, it would fail catastrophically. He stood there for another 10 minutes and then he walked to his workbench, picked up a piece of chalk, and started drawing on the barn wall. Bobby Pruitt came by the next morning and found Dale under the old tractor with a wrench. "What are you doing?" Bobby asked. "Pulling the rear diff," Dale said, without coming out from underneath. Bobby looked at the tractor, at the transmission sitting in the middle of the floor, at the chalk drawings covering 12 square feet of barn wall. He walked over to the wall and studied the drawings for a long time. "Dale," he said, "this is what I think it is. Probably." Bobby was quiet for a moment. "You're going to build a puller." "I'm going to build something," Dale said. "Hand me that half-inch socket." Bobby found the socket and handed it under the tractor. He pulled up a stool and sat down, which meant he intended to stay, which was the only kind of help he ever offered, the kind that didn't announce itself. "What's your pulling force target?" Bobby asked. "Working on it. Somewhere north of 400,000 foot-pounds at the anchor point." Bobby absorbed this. "Current production track pullers topped out around 350, I know. So you're building something with more mechanical advantage than anything commercially available." "I'm building something that'll work," Dale said. "Whether it's supposed to exist or not is a different question." Bobby was quiet for a while. Outside, a tractor moved somewhere on his property. He'd left one of his hired hands to handle the morning rounds. He'd come here himself. That said something about how he understood the situation. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need your cutting torch. Mine's been running low on acetylene." "Done. What else?" "I need about 60 feet of 7/8" grade 70 chain." "I know you've got it." "I do. What else?" "I need you to not tell anyone what I'm doing until it's done." Bobby nodded. That I can do. The word got out anyway. Small towns are constitutionally unable to keep secrets. Not because people are malicious, but because in a community of 1,200 people, an unfamiliar amount of activity at a particular farm becomes part of the ambient information that everyone processes without trying to. Bobby's cutting torch appeared at Dale's barn. A flatbed from the metal salvage yard in Hartwell made 2 trips to the Merritt property in 1 week. Dale was seen at the farm supply store buying welding rod in quantities that suggested a significant project. People began to talk. Ronald Stass heard about it on a Thursday afternoon from the owner of the hardware store, who had filled a specific and unusual order for Dale and felt vaguely like he was delivering information he shouldn't. Stass was in his office above the Cloverfield Savings Building when he heard a well-appointed space with a view of Main Street and the green hills beyond. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with silver hair he kept neat, and a way of moving and speaking that had been consciously refined over 20 years from the rougher version he'd brought back from growing up here. He was not a villain. He genuinely believed that the land he developed was put to better use than it had been under struggling farmers. Light industrial, residential subdivisions, a commercial park off the interstate that had brought 40 jobs to the county. He had a coherent worldview, and it wasn't wrong exactly, just different from Dale Merritt's. He had wanted that land for 2 years. He picked up his phone and called his attorney. If Merritt defaults on his bank payment, he said, I want to be positioned to move quickly. The bank process takes time, his attorney said. You're looking at months. I know how long it takes. I'm asking you to have the paperwork ready. He hung up and looked out the window at the hills for a long time, thinking about a man he'd known his whole life building something in a barn that he probably couldn't build. Caroline arrived on a Friday evening. She had told herself she was coming to talk her father out of whatever he was doing. She had told herself this for most of the 4-hour drive from Nashville. Through the logic of spreadsheets and timelines and reasonable alternatives, the kind of thinking she was good at and had built her career on. She pulled into the driveway at 6:30, and the barn lights were on, and there was the sound of welding from inside. And she sat in her car for a moment before she got out. The barn smell hit her as soon as she opened the side door, metal and grease and acetylene and something deeper underneath, something that had been here since before she was born. She stood in the doorway and looked at what her father was building. It was hard to describe as a single thing. It occupied most of the center floor space. There was the frame of the old tractor, stripped and remounted on a modified chassis that sat lower to the ground than it should have. There was the old transmission, now integrated into a drivetrain that ran through a series of reduction gears, 2 of them fabricated from scratch. The ring gears cut by hand with tools Dale had ground himself. There was a pulling arm extending from the front, a heavy A-frame of 2-inch steel tubing that angled forward and down at approximately 30 degrees. There were anchor points, 4 of them, the kind you'd run ground stakes through, positioned to distribute the reaction force across a wide base. The whole thing was welded together with the particular density of someone who knew exactly how much force was going to pass through each joint and had put metal there accordingly. Dale was underneath the rear section when Caroline came in, working on something with a socket wrench. He came out when he heard her footsteps, stood up, and looked at her. I thought you might come, he said. Dad. She looked at the machine. She looked at him. What is this? A puller? I can see that. She stopped. She walked around it slowly, the way she'd learned to evaluate construction projects, looking at the joints, the load paths, the geometry of the thing. Her father watched her do this without speaking. She stopped at the pulling arm. She put her hand on one of the welds, a beautiful, dense bead, the kind her father had always laid down, the kind she'd grown up watching. She looked at the gear reduction assembly. You fabricated these gears yourself, she said. Had to. Can't buy what I needed. She stood there for a moment. What's your calculated pulling force? Around 430,000 foot-pounds at the anchor point. Depends on the route. She did the math without a calculator. 'Cause she was her father's daughter, and the math was not complicated if you knew what numbers to use. It was more force than any production puller she'd ever heard of. It was the kind of number that either worked or destroyed the machine trying. If any of these welds let go, I know, or if the anchor stakes pull, I know, Caroline. She looked at him. He looked back. There was a whole conversation in that silence, the one they'd been having for years, about risk and inheritance and what it means to hold on to something and what it costs. How long until it's ready? She asked. 4 or 5 more days. She nodded. She set her bag down on his workbench. Show me what still needs doing, she said. They worked through the weekend, the two of them, with Bobby coming in the afternoons. Dale had not asked Caroline to stay, and she had not announced that she was staying. It had simply become the arrangement, the way things sometimes do between people who share a blood logic that operates below the level of words. She called her office Saturday morning and arranged to work remotely for the week. Her supervisor, a practical woman named Diane, asked no questions beyond the logistics. Caroline had accumulated enough professional goodwill over 5 years to cash in a week without explanation. Working alongside her father was a complicated experience. She had grown up in this barn, handing him tools before she understood what they were for, learning the names of things through repetition and context. She had watched him solve problems that had no solutions in any manual, the irrigation system he'd rebuilt from repurposed PVC when the commercial parts were discontinued, the combine modification that had let him harvest a wet season everyone else had written off. Her father was not a formally educated engineer. He was something older than that. Something that understood mechanical force the way a musician understands sound, not through equations, but through a deep, practiced intuition built from decades of asking things to do what he needed them to do. She had left because this world was not big enough for what she wanted to become. She had not left because she didn't love it. Watching him now, crouched over the gear assembly with his reading glasses on the end of his nose and a caliper in his hand, she felt the particular ache of loving something you left behind. The third reduction gear, she said, leaning over his shoulder. The tooth profile? Did you cut that on the lathe? Hand file for the final profile. Lathe got me close. She looked at it. The gear was not a perfect industrial specimen. It was something better. It was exactly what it needed to be, made by a man who knew what he was making it for. It'll hold, she said. It'll hold, he agreed. They didn't talk much about the bank, or about Stas, or about the numbers. They talked about the machine. They talked about the root system. Dale had done his own subsurface mapping over 2 days, using a long steel probe to locate the primary root exactly, marking the spot with a painted stake at the north end of the pocket. They talked about the anchor geometry, and Caroline had suggested a modification to the stake pattern that would distribute the reaction force more evenly, and Dale had looked at it for a long time and said, "That's right in the tone of someone who doesn't waste compliments." On Sunday evening, Bobby came with his wife, Margaret, who brought food in containers and didn't say anything about the machine or the farm or the bank, but simply set the food on the workbench and sat in a lawn chair and talked about her garden and the county fair and the new family that had moved in on the Hendrix's Road. The way she always did, because Margaret Pruitt understood that sometimes the greatest kindness is to make a normal evening in the middle of a crisis. After she and Bobby left, Caroline and Dale sat outside the barn in the cooling air, eating the last of the food. "You should have called me sooner," she said. "You would have told me to sell." She considered this. Maybe. Probably. She looked out toward the pocket, invisible in the dark. "I would have been wrong." Dale was quiet for a moment. "You know what your grandfather used to say about that field?" he said. "Tell me." He said the pocket never let him down. 40 years of farming it, and it never let him down. He paused. "I don't think he meant it was magic. I think he meant it was worth believing in." Caroline looked at her father's profile in the dark, the heavy jaw, the permanent squint, the slight forward lean of a man who'd spent half a century walking into wind. "I know," she said softly. I'm not ready to let it go. I know, Dad. They sat for a while longer and then went inside. On Monday, Ronald Stas drove out to the farm. Dale saw the truck coming down the county road, a late model Silverado, dark blue, the kind of clean that says the truck is a statement rather than a tool, and he stepped out of the barn and waited by the gate. Stas got out and walked over. He was wearing work clothes, the kind bought for the purpose of looking like work clothes, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who was accustomed to conversations going the way he wanted them to go. Dale, he said, extending his hand. Dale shook it. Ronald. They looked at each other the way men do who have known each other since boyhood and taken very different roads. Heard the engineers came out, Stas said. They did. Heard they said the routes couldn't be cleared in time, that's what they said. Stas nodded, his face thoughtful and genuinely sympathetic, which was one of the things about him that made him effective. His sympathy was usually real. I've got a proposal ready, he said. I've been sitting on it because I didn't want to come out here before you'd had a chance to look at your options. But Dale, you're a practical man. You know what the bank letter means. I know what it means. The offer is fair. Better than fair. It's 3% above current market, and I'll take the property as if no contingencies on the pocket or the root situation. You'd walk away from this with enough to clear the debt and start something new. Dale looked at him for a moment. You've known me my whole life, Ronald, he said. I have. Then you know I'm not going to sell. Stas's expression didn't change much, but something shifted slightly behind his eyes. Dale, the math. The math is my business. Dale's voice was quiet and final, the same voice he'd used with the bank, the same voice he'd used with Caroline. It was not an angry voice. It was something more immovable than anger. I appreciate you driving out. Stas stood there for a moment, looking past Dale at the barn, at the open side door, at the glimpse of metal and geometry inside. What are you building? He asked. A puller. A pause. The engineer said, I know what they said. Dale looked at him steadily. The engineers were right about what they brought. They didn't bring what I'm building. Stas was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that Dale couldn't entirely read. Not quite respect. Not quite doubt. Something between them. I hope it works, Stas said, and Dale believed he meant it. Stas walked back to his truck. He didn't drive away immediately. He sat there for a moment, and Dale had the sense of a man recalculating, which was fine. People could recalculate all they wanted as long as they did it from the other side of the gate. On Wednesday, 2 things happened. The first was that Dale finished the machine. He torqued the final bolt on the rear drive assembly at just past noon, stood up, and walked around the entire thing once, slowly, looking at every joint, every weld, every point of connection. He had been building things his whole life, and he knew the difference between something that was finished and something that was done. Finished meant the work was complete. Done meant it was right. This was done. The pulling arm extended 8 feet in front of the chassis, angled down at 30 degrees, with a hook assembly at the end designed to accept the main chain that would connect to the root anchor he'd set the previous afternoon. The anchor was a steel plate, 2 inches thick, welded to a sleeve that had been driven into the ground directly above the primary root using an air hammer, positioned so that the pull angle when the machine engaged would be nearly vertical, not quite, because the geometry of the frame wouldn't allow perfectly vertical, but close enough that the force would drive down and back along the root axis rather than trying to shear it laterally. The gear reduction gave him approximately a 12-to-1 mechanical advantage on the engine's output torque. The engine he'd dropped back into the chassis was a rebuilt diesel he'd been storing, a 466 cubic inch International with a rebuilt injection pump and a fresh valve job. It made 320 horsepower and 450 foot-pounds of torque at the crank. Through the reduction, that became something the world did not have a common word for, because the world did not commonly attempt what he was about to attempt. The second thing that happened on Wednesday was that Arthur Finch from the bank called. He was calling, he said, to discuss the account status. Dale let him say what he'd called to say, that the 90-day window was now at 60 days, that the bank wanted to work with him, that there were options they'd like to discuss. Dale thanked him politely, told him he would be in touch before the deadline, and hung up. He went back to the barn and looked at the machine. Saturday, he said to no one in particular. Caroline heard him say it from the doorway where she'd been watching him on the phone. Saturday, she repeated. Why Saturday? Weather's clear through the weekend. Ground's as dry as it's going to get without making the anchor situation worse. He paused. And I want Bobby there. She nodded. She looked at the machine. She had spent a week working on it alongside him, and she understood every component of it, every choice he'd made, and she still found it slightly overwhelming, not because it was crude or improvised, but because it was the opposite of those things. It was a precise, specific answer to a precise, specific problem, designed by a man who understood the problem at a level that had taken him 26 years of farming this particular piece of ground to develop. Dad, she said. He looked at her. When this works, she stopped, it's going to work. When it works, the bank situation doesn't get solved overnight. The pocket isn't going to produce a harvest this season, even if the roots come out. I know. So we need a plan for the 60 days. He looked at her for a moment, and she recognized the look. It was the same one he'd given her when she was 17 and had figured out something he already knew. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something more compact than a smile, but with the same content. I've been talking to the Farmers Credit Union in Hartwell, he said. Different terms than First County. They like tangible progress as collateral. He paused. Clearing the pocket and getting it ready to plant would count as tangible progress. She blinked. You've already been working on a refinance. For 3 weeks, she stood there for a second. You never said anything. Didn't want to count on it until I knew the other part was possible. He looked at the machine. Now I know it's possible. Caroline looked at her father for a long moment, and she felt something shift inside her, some piece of the way she'd understood him. Some assumption she'd been carrying for years about what he could and couldn't see, beyond the edge of his own fields. You're not just a farmer, she said. I'm exactly a farmer, he said. That's not a small thing. Saturday arrived without drama, the way important days often do, just another morning. The same copper light, the same cicadas, the same coffee on the porch steps. Dale had slept 6 hours, which was more than he'd expected. He lay in bed for a few minutes after he woke, looking at the ceiling, and thought about his father and his grandfather in that photograph, squinting into the sun. He got up, made coffee, and went to the barn. The machine was exactly where he'd left it. He spent an hour doing a final inspection, every bolt, every weld, every chain link, every hydraulic fitting, the way a pilot walks around a plane before flight, not because he doubts his work, but because the work deserves that respect. He found one thing, a hydraulic line clamp that was a quarter turn less tight than he wanted. He tightened it. Everything else was as it should be. Bobby arrived at 7:30 with Margaret and 2 of his farmhands, brothers named Curtis and Lyle Drummond, who were big, quiet men in their late 30s that Dale had known since they were boys. Caroline was already up, drinking coffee in the kitchen, and she came out when she heard the truck. They drank coffee together in the morning, cool, not talking much. The pocket was visible from where they stood, 12 acres of dry grass. The painted stake marking the anchor point catching the early light, the chain running from it back toward the barn like a thin promise. At 8:30, Dale drove the machine out of the barn. It moved slowly, the way heavy things built for power rather than speed move, with a deliberate authority. The engine, at low idle, turning over in the particular rhythm of a diesel that has been properly set up, which is a sound unlike any other mechanical sound, more heartbeat than machine. The modified chassis sat low, the pulling arm tilting slightly as it came off the barn sill, and Bobby and the Drummond brothers walked alongside it through the yard toward the pocket. Dale drove. He brought it through the gate at the eastern end of the pocket and positioned it along the approach line he'd staked out. 3 days earlier, north of the anchor, pulling arm pointed toward it, and chassis oriented so the foreground anchors would be driven in on a line perpendicular to the direction of pull. The geometry had to be exact. If the machine walked during the pull, if the reaction force was allowed to drag the chassis forward instead of being held by the stakes, the pulling arm geometry would shift and the force angle would go wrong and the whole system would fail. Caroline and the Drummond brothers drove the anchor stakes. Dale had fabricated them himself, 3-inch square steel, 4 feet long, with a crossbar welded 12 inches from the top to prevent them from being driven flush. They went in with a hydraulic post driver that Bobby had brought from his equipment shed. 2 operators to a stake, driving them to the crossbar depth, while Dale watched the angle of each one and called adjustments. It took 40 minutes. When it was done, Dale walked each stake himself, putting his weight against it, checking for any give. There was none. He connected the main chain 7/8 inch grade 70, 60 feet. Running from the anchor stake assembly through the hook at the end of the pulling arm and back through a snatch block mounted to the chassis frame, doubled back on itself in a configuration that increased the mechanical advantage further while keeping the chain geometry manageable. He checked every connection. He checked them again. At 10:15, he climbed into the seat. Bobby stood at the fence at the field's edge. Margaret stood beside him with her hand on his arm. Caroline stood 12 feet to the left of the machine, far enough to be clear of any snapback zone if a chain let go, close enough to see everything. The Drummond brothers had moved to the perimeter. Dale sat in the seat for a moment. The engine was running at idle. The smell of diesel and dry grass was thick in the still air. A crow called somewhere to the south and was answered by another, and then it was quiet. He thought about the root beneath him. 150 years of growth locked 12 feet down in clay-heavy soil, spreading in all directions like the memory of a tree. He thought about his grandfather planting around it because it was too big to argue with. He thought about his father doing the same. He thought about all the seasons he had done the same. He thought about the number at the end of the gear reduction chain, the force he was about to ask this thing to deliver, and whether everything would hold. Then he stopped thinking and engaged the drive. The sound changed. The diesel went from idle to loaded in the space of 2 seconds as the drivetrain took up the slack. And the tone dropped the way it does when real work starts, a deepening that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The chain came taut. There was a ringing, metallic sound as 70 feet of grade 70 chain went from slack to loaded, each link seating against the next. The pulling arm settled into its angle and stayed there. Nothing moved. The engine climbed in load. The ground around the anchor stakes compressed slightly. Dale could see it from his seat, the soil depressing a fraction of an inch as the force transferred into the earth. The chassis didn't move. The stakes held. Still, nothing moved beneath the ground. Dale increased the throttle. The diesel was working now, the injection pump delivering fuel in earnest. The turbo, he'd added a turbo. The charger salvaged from a scrapped machine, fitted carefully, spinning up to pressure. The sound filled the pocket, bounced off the ridge to the northwest, and came back, layered over itself. Bobby's hands tightened on the fence rail. Caroline didn't move. Still nothing. And then a sound came from beneath the ground. Not loud, not dramatic, a low bass creak. The sound of something immense being asked a question it had never been asked before. Dale felt it through the seat frame before he heard it through the air. A pressure, a resistance, and then movement. Not much, not yet. Just a slight, almost imperceptible settling of the ground surface around the painted stake. A circle of disturbed earth. Maybe 3 feet across, the soil lifting slightly at the edges the way it does when something below it begins to shift. Dale held the throttle steady. He didn't push for more. He let the force do its work. Constant, enormous, patient force. the kind his grandfather would have recognized even if he'd never seen the machine delivering it. The creaking came again, deeper and longer. From underneath them, a sound like a bass note played on an instrument too large to exist. A groan from the earth itself as something that had been stationary for a century and a half began, slowly, then less slowly, then unmistakably, to move. The surface of the ground erupted. There was no other word for it. The soil split along a line running northeast from the anchor point, then branched, the visible trace of the primary route as the force propagated along it, the earth above lifting and cracking like ice on a warming lake. The crack ran 40 feet, then bent northwest and ran another 20. The sound was enormous and continuous, a tearing and cracking and groaning that filled the air and silenced the birds and caused the crow to the south to go completely quiet. Bobby Pruitt said something under his breath. Margaret's hand tightened on his arm. The root came. Not all at once, it came the way a buried thing comes when it has truly let go. In sections and stages. The primary lateral root pulling free from the clay, in a series of heaving lurches that moved the ground the way a wave moves water, rolling forward in pulses as the chain stayed taut and the engine held its note, and Dale Merritt sat in the seat of his impossible machine and did not look away. The first section of root that broke the surface was massive, as thick as a man's thigh, dark and dense, almost black with age, coming up through the torn earth like something being born way around from the soil. Then the secondary roots, thinner but still enormous, pulling free from their lateral branches and whipping to the surface. The ground between the anchor point and the ridge was moving continuously now. The entire subsurface architecture of a 200-year-old white oak being dismantled from below by a force it had not been built to resist. It took 11 minutes. When it was done, when the diesel finally backed off its load and the sound died down and the dust and the silence settled back over the pocket, the field looked like something had been born from it. The ground was torn in a great irregular pattern. The root system spread across the surface in sections and fragments, dark and ancient and enormous, no longer locked in the earth, but exposed to the sky for the first time since the year the Civil War ended. Dale sat in the seat for a moment after he shut the engine down. Then he climbed out. He walked to the edge of the torn area and stood there looking at it. The roots on the surface, the opened earth. The 12 acres that were going to need work, weeks of clearing and grading and amendment before they could be planted. But tillable, unobstructed. The pocket finally completely open. Bobby came through the gate and stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Your father would have liked to see that," Bobby said finally. Dale nodded. Caroline was standing 10 feet back, and when Dale turned to look at her, she had both hands pressed flat against her face, and her eyes were wet, and she was shaking her head slightly, not in negation, but in the way people do when something they prepared themselves not to believe in turns out to be true. Dale walked over to her. She didn't say anything. She just put her arms around him and held on, and Dale, who had not been a man much given to being held, stood there and let her his big hands on her shoulders, looking over her head at the field that was his father's and his grandfather's and his, the field that no engineer had been able to clear, and that he had cleared with iron and stubbornness, and the precise kind of love that doesn't have a word for itself in any language. The Drummond brothers were very busy studying their boots. Bobby Pruitt was looking at the sky with the expression of a man who is not crying. Margaret was crying openly and making no apology for it. "I have to call the credit union on Monday," Dale said into Caroline's hair. She laughed, a wet, surprised sound. "I know, and we're going to need to rent a brush hog to clear this surface material." "I know, and the grading's going to take, Dad." She pulled back and looked at him, her face blotchy and fierce and entirely his daughter. "I know. We'll figure it out, he said. She nodded. They didn't know, standing there in the pocket on that Saturday morning. that there was a car parked on the county road at the field's edge, having arrived sometime during the 11 minutes of the pull. They didn't know that Arthur Finch, the young loan officer from First County Bank, had driven out after receiving a call from someone, he would never say who, that something was happening at the Merritt farm worth seeing. They didn't know he had watched the entire thing. They didn't know that he had sat in his car afterward for a long time, looking at a field that had just been declared impossible and then very concretely wasn't, and that he had driven back to town with a particular feeling he would later describe to his wife as being approximately like watching someone do something you'd been told couldn't be done, and discovering in the process that the category of can't be done was smaller than you'd thought. They didn't know any of that yet. What they knew was the pocket, open in the late morning light, ready for what came next. The news spread through Cloverfield the way things spread in small towns, not through any single channel, but through all of them simultaneously. The way water finds its way through soil, appearing in unexpected places before you've tracked where it started. By Saturday afternoon, people in town knew that Dale Merritt had pulled the roots. By Sunday morning, half the county knew it. By Monday, there were 4 different versions of the stories circulating, each one slightly more dramatic than the last. But all of them agreeing on the essential fact: the thing the engineers said couldn't be done had been done, and Dale Merritt had done it with the machine he'd built in his own barn. Dale himself said nothing publicly. He went to church Sunday morning the way he always did, sat in the same pew he'd sat in for 30 years, spoke to people in the way he always spoke to them, directly, briefly, without elaboration, and drove home. If he was aware of the fact that people were looking at him differently, he gave no sign of it. At home, the work had already begun. The brush hog he'd rented from the equipment yard in Hartwell arrived Sunday afternoon, and Dale spent the rest of the day running it across the surface root material, cutting it down to manageable size. The Drummond brothers came back Monday and Tuesday with Bobby's front loader, stacking the cleared root sections along the northern fence line, where they'd be burned in the fall. A soil amendment company out of Cookville, one whose owner had heard what had happened and made a point of calling personally, sent a technician to assess what the torn soil would need before fall planting. The credit union in Hartwell called Monday morning. Dale had the conversation standing at the kitchen window looking out at the pocket, which was, for the first time in 3 years, showing its full 12 acres without obstruction. The conversation with the credit union went differently than the conversations with Arthur Finch had gone. The loan officer there was a woman named Patricia Saunders, who had worked agricultural lending for 22 years and understood land the way Dale understood engines through accumulated specific knowledge that no amount of formal education replaced. She asked him 3 questions about the soil condition, 2 questions about the expected planting timeline, and 1 question about what he was planning to grow in the pocket next season. Then she told him the credit union could offer a refinancing package that would consolidate his existing debt at a lower rate, using the cleared and tillable pocket acreage as part of the collateral basis. "We like to work with people who solve problems," Patricia Saunders said. "I appreciate that," Dale said. He signed the paperwork Wednesday afternoon. Caroline stayed through the following weekend. She had not planned to, and she did not make a formal announcement about it. She simply kept being there, working alongside her father in the mornings, making calls to her office in the afternoons from the kitchen table, eating dinner with him in the evenings. It had been years since she'd spent more than 2 or 3 days at the farm, at a stretch, and she had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully known, having left before she was old enough to see it clearly, what the rhythm of this place felt like from the inside. It was not a romantic rhythm. It was not peaceful in the way that people who don't farm imagine farming to be peaceful. It was hard and early and physical and relentless, and it asked everything of a person every day without ceremony or acknowledgement, and the only reward it consistently offered was the reward of the work itself, the thing done. The field turned, the fence repaired, the machine running when it hadn't been running before. But there was something in it that she had not found anywhere else. She thought about it on Wednesday evening, sitting on the porch steps where her father had sat the morning the engineers came, watching the last light go off the hills to the west. The pocket was a different field now, still rough, still in need of weeks of preparation, but open. You could look across it and see all 12 acres at once, unobstructed. The soil dark and turned where the root clearing had happened, the rest of it dry but honest ground waiting for rain. She thought about projects. She managed them for a living complex. Multivariable problems with budgets and timelines and stakeholders and risk assessments. She was good at it. She had built a career on being good at it, on the ability to see a complicated system and understand which variables mattered most and in what order to address them. Her father had done something different here. He had not managed the problem. He had not assessed it and escalated it and brought in the appropriate resources. He had looked at it from the inside out, from the specific particular knowledge of this soil, this root, this machine, this field, and built an answer that could not have been built any other way by any other person in any other place. She didn't know what to do with that, exactly. She didn't know what it meant for the choices she'd made or the life she'd built in Nashville. But she knew she was sitting with it differently than she would have sat with it a week ago. Her father came out with 2 mugs of coffee and sat down beside her. They were quiet for a while. "I've been thinking," she said. About next season. The pocket." She paused. Winter wheat would be the fastest cash crop for spring. Get it in by October, harvest in June. That's what I was thinking. Combined with the northern field and soybeans, that covers the credit union payment and leaves margin. She paused. "Not much margin." "Enough," he said. She nodded. She held the warm mug in both hands. "I'd like to help with the business side. Not from here. I can do it remotely. The financial planning, the crop insurance, the grant applications. There are federal programs for farms under economic stress that you've never applied to, because I don't like asking for money. Because you don't like asking," she said. "There's a difference. It's not charity. It's programs you've been paying into for 30 years through your taxes." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it," he said. Which, from Dale Merritt, was approximately the same as yes. Caroline looked at the hills. A whippoorwill was calling somewhere down by the dry creek bed. The same call it made every summer evening. The same call she had heard from this porch. Every summer evening of her childhood. "Do you remember," she said, "when I was maybe 12, and Grandpa's planter broke down 2 days before he needed to have the south field in? And you stayed up all night fixin' it? I remember. I sat in the barn with you until about 2 in the morning. I fell asleep on the tool bench." "You did." Mom was furious. She was. "But you let me stay." She paused. "You always let me stay. In the barn, on the tractor, wherever you were working. You never told me it wasn't a place for me." Dale looked out at the field. "Why would I tell you that?" A lot of fathers would have. He thought about this for a moment. "This is your land too," he said. The whole point was always that it'd be yours too someday. Caroline felt the thing she'd been carrying for years, the specific weight of someone who left and wasn't sure they had the right to come back, shift slightly in her chest. Not gone, just different. Less like guilt and more like something she could actually look at. "I know," she said. "I know that now." Arthur Finch came out to the farm on Thursday. He came alone, without advance notice, which was unusual enough that Dale stood in the doorway watching the unfamiliar bank car come down the driveway and thought for a moment that he was bringing paperwork, an acceleration of the foreclosure process, something bureaucratic and final. Instead, Finch got out of the car, looking slightly awkward. A young man in pressed clothes standing in a farmyard and held up one hand in a sort of apologetic wave. "Mr. Merritt, I know I should have called." "I would have told you not to come," Dale said. "So maybe it's fine." Finch almost smiled. He stood in the driveway, and looked at the barn, at the fields, at the machine, which was still sitting at the edge of the pocket where Dale had parked it after the pull, because there hadn't been time yet to move it back. "I was there," Finch said. "Saturday. I pulled over on the road." Dale looked at him. "I watched the whole thing," Finch said. A pause. "What did you think?" Dale asked. Finch was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care of someone who is aware they are choosing them imprecisely for something they don't fully have language for yet. "I thought I'd been applying the wrong framework," he said. "To the numbers, to this farm, to you." He paused. "I'm not saying the bank will modify the terms. That's not my decision alone. But I want you to know that I submitted a recommendation to the loan committee this morning. The cleared acreage, the refinancing you've arranged with Hartwell, the demonstrated capacity, I recommended they consider those factors as materially changed circumstances." Dale looked at him for a long time. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," Finch said. "I did, actually. I think I did." He glanced at the machine again. "What are you going to do with it?" "Puller." Dale followed his gaze. He hadn't thought much about it. The machine had served its purpose and in his mind had passed from project to artifact. He looked at it now with fresh consideration. "Keep it," he said. "Put it in the barn." Finch nodded. He extended his hand and Dale shook it. "Good luck with the harvest," Finch said. "Thank you for coming out," Dale said. He watched the bank car go back down the driveway and turn onto the county road and disappear, and he stood there in the sun for a moment, thinking about frameworks and the people who carry them, and the specific difficulty of changing one's mind in public, which takes a particular kind of courage he hadn't previously associated with bank loan officers. He gave the man credit for it. Then he went back to work. Ronald Stass called on Friday afternoon. Dale answered on the third ring, standing in the pocket with a soil probe in his hand. "I heard about the credit union arrangement," Stass said without preamble. "News travels." "It does." A pause. "I'm not calling to make another offer." "All right. I'm calling to tell you." Stass paused again. Dale could hear him working through something, the slight hesitation of a man who is more comfortable with transactions than with the other kind of conversation. "I drove by Saturday. On my way back from Hartwell, I saw it." Dale waited. "I've been buying land in this county for 12 years, Stass said. "I've bought it from farmers who had no options left. I've told myself they were better off, that I was giving them a clean exit, a fair price, a way out." A pause. "I've mostly believed that." "Mostly," Dale said. "Watching you," Stass stopped. Started again. "I've been thinking about what it is I've been buying when I buy a farm. What actually transfers in that transaction? The land, yes. The structures, the equipment." Another pause. "But watching you Saturday, I thought some things don't transfer. Some things just end when the family leaves." Dale stood in the middle of the pocket with the soil probe in his hand and looked at the torn earth around him and thought about what to say to a man he'd known his whole life who had just said something true. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right." The pause on the line was long enough to have weight. "I'm glad it worked," Stass said finally. "Appreciate it, Ronald." He hung up and stood there for a while looking at the field. The fall came on schedule. Late September brought the first real rain since early May. Not a dramatic event, just a quiet, steady overnight rain that lasted 14 hours and left the fields smelling of wet earth and turned the dry creek at the southern edge of the property back into a creek. Dale stood on the porch at 5 in the morning listening to it fall and felt something in his chest that he couldn't have named precisely, but that had to do with continuity, with the specific comfort of a thing working the way it's supposed to work. The winter wheat went into the pocket in the first week of October. It took 3 days to plant, Dale running the drill himself, Caroline driving the tractor on the second day, when his knee flared up, and he accepted without excessive argument that she was better positioned to put in a 12-hour tractor day than he was. The soil in the pocket, amended, graded, and turned through September, received the seed well. It was good soil. It'd always been good soil. That was the whole point. Bobby came over the evening they finished, and the four of them, Dale, Caroline, Bobby, Margaret, sat on the porch and watched the last light go off the planted field. The wheat wouldn't show for another 2 weeks, but it was in the ground, and the ground was right, and that was enough for an October evening. 3 generations planted this farm, Bobby said after a while. 4 now, Caroline said. She hadn't meant it as an announcement. It came out quietly, as a simple statement of arithmetic. Dale looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them. Not a plan, not a promise, just a possibility that had become more possible, a future that had been one shape in August, and was a different shape now. "You thinking about coming back?" he asked. "I'm thinking about a lot of things," she said. "Remote work is more feasible than it used to be, and the business side of this operation needs someone systematic." She paused. "I'm not saying I'm moving back tomorrow. I'm not asking you to," he said, "but I'm not saying it either." Dale was quiet for a moment. Bobby was studying the middle distance with elaborate casualness. Margaret was smiling at her coffee cup. "The house has got the spare room," Dale said. "Needs paint. Everything on this farm needs paint," Caroline said. "That's true. I'll think about it. I know you will." The creek was running audibly from where they sat the first time since May, its sound carrying up through the quiet evening air. The pocket was dark and still, the wheat seed in the ground. The root system that had locked it for 3 years now stacked along the northern fence in sections waiting for the fall burn. The machine was in the barn under a fresh canvas tarp, next to his grandfather's equipment and his father's equipment, part of the family archive now. Dale held his coffee mug and listened to the creak and thought about the photograph in the kitchen, his father and his grandfather squinting into the sun with their arms at their sides and that particular expression on their faces. He understood it now completely, in a way he hadn't when he was young, and hadn't quite when he was middle-aged and had come to fully only here. At 54, on a porch in Tennessee in October, with the wheat in the ground and the debt restructured, and his daughter beside him. It wasn't stubbornness on their faces, or it wasn't only stubbornness. It was something more precise. It was the expression of men who had been told, in various ways and by various people and circumstances, that a thing could not be done, and who had looked at those people and those circumstances and made a quiet, unspectacular decision that the category of impossible was not as large as advertised. It was not arrogance. They were not arrogant men. Dale was not an arrogant man. It was something simpler than arrogance and harder than confidence. It was the decision made fresh every morning to go out into the field and do the work. The creek ran in the dark below them, the wheat was in the ground, the pocket was open. In the spring, the wheat came up even across all 12 acres of the pock for the first time in 3 years, thick and green and exactly what it was supposed to be. The kind of crop that a good field produces when you give it back the chance. Dale walked the rows in April with his hands in his pockets and Bobby walking beside him, and neither of them said very much because some things don't need saying. Caroline drove up from Nashville that weekend and walked the rows too, and she took a photograph on her phone and looked at it for a long time, not posting it anywhere, just keeping it the green field, her father's back, the ridge to the northwest, the sky above Cloverfield, Tennessee, doing what skies do in April, which is to say, everything at once and none of it for show.